Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. My name is Heather Wild, and we're going to be talking about weird psychology and what this means for language and literacy research. Over the past few decades, there have been growing concerns about how the vast majority of psychological research relies on weird samples. That is, Western and educated individuals from industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And in particular, this includes American undergraduate students who make up a large part of this group. In 2008, Arnett analyzed samples in APA published studies and found that 2/3 of all the samples came from the US alone, and 95% were from European or English-speaking countries. What's more is anywhere from 67 to 80% of these samples were made up of entirely undergraduate students. Around the same time, Scher found that language research also had a massive bias towards studying the alphabetic languages of Europe, and not surprisingly, English was dominant among them. Now, studying weird samples isn't in itself a problem as long as these findings are interpreted within these populations. However, one of the core goals of psychology is to understand human behavior and the human mind. And when we as researchers don't make explicit disclaimers about the generalizability of our findings, the implication is that this pretty specific weird group represents the entire human population. But we have evidence that this isn't always the case. In their landmark paper, Henrichhein and Nurenzian showed how weird individuals behave differently from non-weird individuals in a number of domains, including visual perception, holistic versus analytic reasoning, moral reasoning, and personality measures, just to name a few. They also found that weird students differed even from the non-students of the same population. So before we can draw conclusions from weird minds to human minds, we need to determine just how representative a weird sample is in a given domain. In other words, how weird is weird? We seek to answer this question for the domains of literacy and numeracy. Specifically, we ask how well do students' literacy and numeracy skills represent other groups within their country, and is there evidence for the existence of a weird bias in these domains? Given the bias towards studying European languages, and because literacy and numeracy are skills that university students are specifically trained on and selected for, we predicted students would not be very representative and that we would see a weird bias. We analyzed publicly available data from the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, or PIAC. This is an international survey assessing adult literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skills. The scores in all the PIAC tests are psychometrically validated and are directly comparable across countries and languages of administration. It also collected rich demographic data, which included education, occupation, and language background information. Most importantly for our study, each participating country was required to produce a probability-based sample with a minimum size of 5,000 that was representative of the population of adults aged 16 to 65 in their country. After trimming, we were left with data from the 32 countries highlighted on the map and from 24 different languages. Using this data, we calculated mean literacy and numeracy scores for 3 groups in each country. The first was the student sample, which we defined as anyone aged 16 to 24 who completed at least upper secondary education and indicated they were either studying or working while studying at the time of assessment. The general group included all adults not part of the student sample, and our young or non-student sample was everybody 16 to 24 who was not part of the student group. We then used Cohen's d to estimate effect sizes for the comparisons of literacy and numeracy scores between the students and their respective country's general population, and the students and the non-students, which allowed us to account for aging and cohort effects. In each country, the student's mean literacy score was greater than both the non-student and the general population scores. On the right, we plotted the Cohen's d values for the student versus general comparisons. Countries are listed along the x-axis, and the d values are along the y-axis. We then evaluated our effect sizes against the average effect size observed in experimental psychology, which is a Cohen's d of 0.4. This is marked by the solid black line. And as you can see, only 8 of the 32 countries were below this threshold, and the median effect size between students and the general population was a Cohen's d of 0.56. which is well above the threshold. The effect size for the group comparisons between the student and the young samples were slightly stronger and less dispersed. Only 6 countries were at or below our threshold level, and again, the median effect size was well above it at a Cohen's d of 0.55. We also put these effect sizes into perspective by drawing an informal analogy to a more visual example of group differences. What we did is we compared the body mass index of different groups of athletes and physically active professionals to that of the general population. BMI is a measure that correlates to body fat, and we chose it because it mirrors literacy and numeracy in that professional athletes and individuals in physically demanding jobs both self-select and are selected for based partially on their physical fitness, the same way that university students are self-selecting and selected for based partially on their cognitive skills. We calculated Cohen's d values for group comparisons between the general population's BMI and that of police officers, firefighters, weightlifters, soldiers, and Olympic speed skaters and skiers. Then we mapped the d-values from our BMI comparisons onto the previous plot, and what we can see is on average, students' literacy levels are about as different from the general and non-student groups as a weightlifter's BMI score is from that of the general population. When we look at the numeracy scores, they followed the same trends as literacy. Students, again, had higher mean numeracy scores than the non-student and the general samples in every country, and the median effect size for the student versus general comparison was a d of 0.42, and the student versus young comparison had a median d of 0.55. And again, both these values exceed the threshold from experimental psychology, which was a Cohen's d of 0.4. This leads us to conclude that the weird bias does in fact exist in literacy and numeracy research, and that it's inaccurate to treat students as a group representative of the population at large, and even less accurate to treat students as a group representative of individuals their age. To put inaccuracy into perspective, let's imagine a highly powered pre-registered psychological experiment with a treatment group and a control group. Imagine further that this group difference shows an effect stronger than those typically observed in experimental psychology, i.e. a Cohen's d greater than 0.4. Imagine finally that the experimenter interprets the behavior of the treatment group as a valid approximation of the control group. In fact, they view the results as support for the null hypothesis and claim the treatment group is representative of the entire population. This absurd scenario is a statistical equivalent of assuming students' language behavior represents the behavior of the general or age-matched populations of speakers of the same language. One of the limitations of our study is that admittedly the 32 countries we end up analyzing are somewhat skewed towards weird characteristics, and as you can see on the map, it's mostly European and North American countries, and the majority have stable democracies and are economically developed. Nevertheless, the students and all other groups we defined in the PIAC data are represented with the same probability that they naturally occur in that country, so we were able to avoid within-country biases. We also only focused on the representativeness of students, given the tendency to draw convenient samples of undergrads in psychology, but future research could definitely break down the weird characteristics further and look at comparisons between, say, East and Western cultures or high and low socioeconomic status. So what does the weird bias mean for us? Well, it challenges the external validity and generalizability of many findings in language research. If our goal is to understand how language is represented in the human mind and not just the weird mind, we need to keep shifting our current research culture to be more representative. We can do this by building partnerships with other researchers, particularly in non-weird countries, to collect cross-linguistic data, and we can collect data more broadly and representatively within our own countries, and make this data freely available to help future comparative research efforts. On the other hand, when we are working with weird student populations, it's important to explicitly address the limitations of generalizability in our findings so that we avoid implying students represent the general population. Thank you so much for listening.